chapter 24, exercise in the environment. And we're just going to go over the hypoxic portion of this chapter. We already discussed exercise in the heat, as well as touched on very lightly in the cold in chapter 12. So we're just going to go into the hypoxic portion of this chapter, and we're not going to go that much in detail. We're just going to kind of touch on the topic. You could really spend a few weeks on this topic, but we're just going to touch on it for now. All right, so looking at altitude, and that's usually what we're discussing when we say hypoxia. Although hypoxic condition, basically a low oxygen or a low partial pressure of oxygen, can occur at different environments. But when we really talk about hypoxia, a lot of times we're referring to altitude. So you can see down there, hypoxia, and this is referring to at least elevation. Hypoxia is referring to the low partial pressure of oxygen. Normoxia is sea level, and hyperoxia is then a high PO2. All right, a lot of that is going to be below sea level, especially once we get like deep sea diving. So if we look at atmospheric pressure at sea level, we have 1 atm or 1 atmosphere. All right, and that's the pressure basically pushing down on you, pushing down on everything. All right, no matter where you go, you're going to have the same percentage of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. So we're going to have approximately 21% oxygen, 0.03% carbon dioxide, and we're going to have about 79% nitrogen within the air. That's not going to change if you go from sea level to, say, Pikes Peak, maybe 14,000 feet, or Mount Everest. Those numbers are not going to change. But what's going to change is going to be the partial pressure. All right, and this is going to be referring to Boyle's law. So within a given, volume of air at sea level, right, you're going to have the same percentage of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. As you travel up in altitude, going to, look at the chart here, Mexico City, Pikes Peak. If you had a balloon and you captured some air at sea level, and as you rise in altitude, that balloon will get bigger and bigger. The same percentage of those molecules of oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, those are still going to be there. But what has changed is the entire volume of that air has become a little bit more dilute. All right, meaning that the partial pressure has now decreased. Remember, partial pressure is related to the atmospheric pressure. All right, so you just multiply the atmospheric pressure times the percentage of what these are at. So at sea level, at 760 millimeters of mercury, you'll have a certain PO2 of oxygen. And as you climb in altitude, you're going to decrease the atmospheric pressure, therefore decreasing the partial pressure of oxygen. Now, looking at the effects of performance on this lower PO2. For short-term anaerobic performance, it really doesn't have any effect. And in fact, the lower air resistance that we see at altitude can actually improve performance in anaerobic events, such as maybe a 100, 200, maybe 400 meter run. But once we get up into longer events, then we're going to start to see some effects going on. So we have some short races here. We have Tokyo, essentially being approximately sea level, and then we have Mexico City, which, if we refer back to the previous slide, Mexico City being approximately 7,200 feet. So if we see what in 64, what the 100-meter dash winner was 10 seconds, and they dropped 0.1 seconds going to altitude. And the same thing, almost a half a second better in the 200 meters, and close to second and a half better in the 400 meters. And the same thing in the 800, but now we're starting to get less and less of a difference. And the same thing for the females as well. So again, short-term anaerobic performance can actually benefit from the lower air resistance. And we see this also with kickers in football, kicking a football. It'd be because of the air resistance is a little bit less, they can kick that football just a little bit further. If you look at the Colorado Rockies play approximately a mile above sea level. And when they first opened their stadium, there was a lot of home runs that were hit because the ball's going to travel a certain distance further. I think it's something like 7% further than what it would at sea level. So what they actually started doing is that before the game, they actually put their baseballs in a humidor to, ingrain some moisture into the balls so that they won't travel as far. They'll be a little bit heavier and they won't go the distance that they normally would. But again, if we look at long-term aerobic performance, this will be decreased with increases in altitude. Especially the really long distance, the 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 meter runs. You can see the differences here. There were decreases in performance with these because it's going to be related to the amount of oxygen that's able to be extracted, right, from the arteries into the muscles, and we're not going to be able to get as much as we go to altitude. All right, so let's look at maximal aerobic capacity. So this is the VO2 max. It will decrease at altitude, and it's fairly linear. As we increase the altitude, we're going to linearly decrease the VO2 max. Now remember that VO2 max is going to be equal to the cardiac output max times the AVO2 difference max. So our heart rate and our stroke volume are going to remain relatively unchanged for the most part. There might be some slight changes in stroke volume, but the heart rate max is just based on your age, 220 minus your age. So that's going to be age predicted. So we've taken care of cardiac output. That's not necessarily going to change all that much. Maybe, again, a little bit, but not in great amounts. What will change is going to be the AVO2 difference, because we're not going to have as much oxygen in the arterioles or the arteries versus at sea level. Therefore, this difference is going to be decreased, and that's what's going to cause the decrease in VO2 max. So the major factor then is going to be the oxygen extraction. That low partial pressure of oxygen is going to cause low alveolar PO2 within the lungs, and we're not going to have as much getting into the arteries. So we have a decrease in what is known as SaO2, right, which is the arterial saturation, which is simply basically referring to this number right here. Right, but generally speaking, this SaO2 is going to be represented as a percentage. Normally, it's going to be the percentage of the hemoglobin that is bound to oxygen, or the oxygen that is bound to hemoglobin. Now, one way to measure this SaO2 is if you've ever been in a hospital, been in surgery, and the little device that they'll put on your finger, kind of a little clamp, that is known as a pulse oximeter. And that actually measures SaO2. All right, so getting into the meat of the of the reason why we have this decrement in VO2 and VO2 max overall, and why we have performance decreases in aerobic performance. So if we look at sea level, 760 millimeters mercury, and we've seen this figure before here on the left. So coming in to the lungs, we have 155 millimeters of mercury PO2 within the alveoli. And then in the capillaries surrounding them, we have approximately 104. So we have this huge difference. All right, so we're going to have oxygen extraction and diffusion going from the alveoli to the capillaries and then back to the heart through the arterial blood. And then we get down to the muscles. We extract the oxygen. We're going to pick up carbon dioxide as well, but we're going to extract the oxygen and we end up with less of a partial pressure, or basically a concentration on the opposite side, going through the veins back to the heart and then working its way back to the lungs. When we get to altitude, say 4,300 meters, and we're down to 460 millimeters of mercury of atmospheric pressure, we're going to start off of a PO2 coming into the lungs at the alveoli of 96 millimeters of mercury, significantly less than at 159 at sea level. So now that difference is greatly decreased. So we're not going to be able to get as much oxygen into the arteries going back to the heart and eventually working its way to the muscle, to the working tissues. So instead of 100 millimeters of mercury making its way back to the heart, we're going to have 42. And that's basically going to be the same until we get to the muscles. And again, we have this low partial pressure of oxygen at altitude compared to at sea level, and we're not going to be extracting as much oxygen. Even though the muscles crave it, they want it, it's just not there. Now, on the other side, we're going to have a little bit lower PO2 than what we had in the veins at sea level, but the difference isn't going to be as high. If we can see there, the difference 60 versus 15, we have significantly decreased the AVO2 difference. And this is the major factor why our VO2 and our VO2 max decreases at altitude, just because we're starting off with less oxygen coming in, and we're just not able to extract enough to make up for the decrease in the oxygen that we're starting off with, that we're delivering to the muscles, right? Because the muscles need that oxygen for ATP. Now, again, this is an aerobic exercise. And again, the reason why the anaerobic performance is not decreased because of this is because the anaerobic performance, the muscles don't necessarily need oxygen. Now, we're still going to go through aerobic metabolism and oxidative phosphorylation with the electron transport chain, but most of it's just going to be with the ATP, PCR, and anaerobic glycolysis. So we don't need oxygen for that. So that's not going to be a major factor when we're looking at purely anaerobic performance. But for aerobic exercise, it will make a huge, huge difference. So then going back to the heart, then we have a low PO2 and again, low PO2. So again, it's all about what's going on with the oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen coming into the lungs. Now, also, as we get up to altitude, we start to ascend to altitude. A couple things our bodies try to do to make up for this decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen and the decrease in the arterial saturation is that our heart rate will increase. And we can see here on the left as the intensity of the exercise increases, we're going to increase our heart rate at sea level and at altitude, but at altitude, it's going to be higher. It's even starting off at a higher rate. The same thing with pulmonary ventilation, breathing, just in and out breathing. Not only is our breathing going to get a little bit faster, but it's going to get deeper as well. And you can kind of feel it. Once you start ascending to altitude, you can sometimes feel your heart rate increase, but you can really feel your breathing pattern increase as well. And it's, all right, it's really deep breaths, really quick, because what's happening is since you're trying to make up, let me get back to the slide. You're trying to make up for this decrease in the PO2 that's basically being, or the oxygen that's being extracted. So because you don't have as much. So your heart is trying to beat as fast as possible to get as much blood to the muscles, to get as much oxygen to the muscles as well. At the same time, your breathing increases to try to increase the amount of oxygen that you're bringing into the lungs, therefore, hopefully increasing the amount of oxygen in the arteries going back to the heart and thus going to the muscles as well. So that's why we have this increase as we increase altitude, this increase in pulmonary ventilation. Again, this one is referring to the liters per minute. So the volume and basically the overall volume per minute, but also the rate per minute is increasing and the breaths get a little bit deeper as well. Now, looking at acclimatization, or again, acclimation, two terms can be used interchangeably. One thing that does happen is that we increase our red blood cell production, known as polycythemia. And this is from erythropoietin, or EPO, which is released, which increases the red blood cell production. And if we increase the red blood cell production, we increase the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, because that's what the oxygen is binding to, is the red blood cells, or the hemoglobin within the red blood cells. So this is just all trying to counteract the low partial pressure of oxygen. Now, one thing I do want to say is this is a natural release of EPO. And a lot of times, if you follow cycling at all, you know that EPO is known as a ergogenic aid or a performance enhancing substance. And basically, there is synthetic types of EPO that can increase red blood cell production, which can help in aerobic performance, such as cycling, long distance cycling, Tour de France's. And that's why a lot of the cyclists were on it. Another way to do this would be to basically take out some of your blood, store it, and it can only be stored up to about 5 to 7 days before the red blood cells start to break down. And then during that time, your body starts to make more red blood cells. And then at the end of that week, you reinfuse the blood back into you. So that's another way that you could also do it as well, that a lot of people have done it that way. There's also other ways of taking someone else's blood and putting it in, but then you get into some blood-borne illnesses, some infections along with that as well. But this is the natural way to do it, and this will occur. So you do also have an improved SaO2 because you'll have an increase in blood flow to the lungs. Your respiration will be increased. Also, the muscles that help you breathe will also be more developed and more trained. The vascular endothelial growth factors will also take effect. Basically, we're going to start creating more capillaries, so blood can get into more, I guess, basically crevices surrounding the muscles in the muscle fibers. Nitric oxide production will also increase, and this increases vasodilation, again, to allow for more blood flow to the muscles. And the plasma volume will also increase. All right, let's look at training. There's a few different ways that people want to try to maximize this adaptation that will occur at altitude. And there's 3 different ways that people have tried this. One is living high, basically living at altitude, as well as training at altitude. All right, so the theory behind this is that you'll have the adaptation response, and that exercise at altitude will also maximize the adaptation. However, what has been seen is that the adaptation does occur when you are exposed to altitude, especially for long periods of time, weeks, months. All right, those adaptations, that acclimatization does occur. However, your training is going to decrease because you're still not going to be able to get to the point to where you were or where you would be at sea level. So your intensity is still going to have to decrease. Your VO2 max is still going to be decreased. So you're not going to respond and increase your VO2 max or your training status, aerobic capacity, through living high and also training high, again, at altitude. The other way would be living low and training high. So living at sea level and training at altitude. The theory behind this is that basically at altitude, just that little exposure at altitude that you have with the exercise, you are going to respond and adapt to that and acclimatize. However, there's really little to no adaptation. There might be a slight increase in hemoglobin and some slight increases in some of the other things that we talked about. But again, the intensity is going to have to decrease when you're training at altitude. You're not going to be able to perform at a higher intensity, and your rating of perceived exertion is going to be a lot higher at a given intensity as well compared to sea level. Now, the one that has been seen to actually work is living high, living at altitude, and training low. And living doesn't necessarily mean you have to be there 23 out of the 24 hours of the day. It's basically just sleeping at altitude. So, 8 to 10 hours basically is really all you need at altitude for some of those adaptations to occur. The other side of this, the training at lower altitudes maximizes your intensity that you can perform at. So not only are you adapting to the hypoxic environment, that low partial pressure of oxygen, but you're also adapting to the increases in intensity during the exercise. So you're really maximizing the benefits from both high altitude and low altitude during this type of training when taking advantage of, the low PO2 of oxygen and those adaptations that will occur at altitude. All right, that was chapter 24. That was kind of a short one. Again, we just went into the hypoxic part of this chapter, exercise in the environment. Again, we covered the heat for the most part in chapter 12, and again, a very small amount of it, of the cold in chapter 12 as well. But again, if you have any questions, let me know. Email me or put a comment in the comment section. So I thank you for watching.